The air tasted like copper and dying grass when Katherine Adams stepped off the stagecoach in Fort Smith, Arkansas, her lungs burning with each breath as she surveyed the dusty frontier town that would become her new home. She had traveled over 800 miles from Philadelphia, leaving behind the comfortable parlors and manicured gardens of her father's estate, all because of a promise she had made to her late mother to start a school for the children of the frontier. The year was 1867, and the war had ended only 2 years prior, leaving scars across the land that still bled fresh in places like this, where Confederate sympathizers and Union loyalists lived in uneasy proximity, their hatred simmering just beneath the surface of everyday civility. Katherine adjusted her bonnet against the relentless afternoon sun, her dark hair already beginning to escape its careful arrangement after days of travel. She was 22 years old, educated at the finest schools the East Coast had to offer, and utterly unprepared for the reality of life in a town where wooden sidewalks were considered a luxury and most buildings looked like a strong wind might carry them away. Her traveling dress was covered in a fine layer of dust, and she could feel perspiration gathering beneath the high collar despite her best efforts to maintain some semblance of dignity. A man approached her, his weathered face breaking into a gap-toothed smile. "Miss Adams." "I'm Harold Peterson, the mayor's assistant. We've been expecting you. The schoolhouse is all ready for you, though I should warn you it is not what you might be accustomed to back east." Katherine forced a smile, though her heart was already sinking. The schoolhouse, when they reached it, 10 minutes later, was little more than a single room with rough-hewn benches and a chalkboard that had seen better days. But she had not come all this way to turn back at the first sign of difficulty. Her mother had believed in the power of education to transform lives, and Katherine would honor that belief no matter what obstacles stood in her way. The first few days passed in a blur of cleaning, organizing, and meeting the families whose children would attend her school. Some welcomed her warmly, grateful that someone educated had come to teach their sons and daughters. Others viewed her with suspicion, this Eastern woman with her proper speech and fine manners, who clearly had no understanding of the harsh realities of frontier life. Katherine ignored the skeptics and threw herself into her work, determined to prove that she belonged here. Quincy Fletcher had been working cattle since he was old enough to sit a horse, and at 26, there was nothing about the ranching life he did not know. He had fought for the Union during the war, though he rarely spoke of those years, preferring to let the past stay buried where it belonged. Now he worked for the Triple R Ranch, one of the largest outfits in the Arkansas Territory, managing a crew of cowboys who respected his quiet competence and fair-minded approach to the work. He first saw Katherine Adams on a Saturday afternoon when he rode into town for supplies. She was standing outside the general store, arguing with a burly man twice her size about the price of chalk and paper. The man was insisting she pay twice the going rate, clearly trying to take advantage of her Eastern ignorance. But Katherine was holding her ground with a fierce determination that made Quincy stop and watch. "I may be new to Fort Smith, but I am not a fool," Katherine said, her voice carrying clearly across the dusty street. "I have checked with 3 other merchants in town, and they all quoted me a fair price. If you cannot match it, I will take my business elsewhere." The merchant's face turned red with anger. "You think you are so smart, coming here from back east with your fancy dresses and your high opinions. Maybe you should go back where you came from." Quincy found himself moving forward before he had consciously decided to intervene. "I think the lady made herself clear, Hoskins. Either you sell her those supplies at a fair price, or you explain to the rest of the town why you are trying to cheat the new schoolteacher." Hoskins glared at him, but there was fear in his eyes too. Quincy had a reputation for being slow to anger but formidable when pushed. "Fine," Hoskins muttered, "but do not expect any special treatment in the future." Katherine turned to Quincy, her green eyes assessing him carefully. "Thank you for your assistance, though I had the situation well in hand." Quincy touched the brim of his hat. "I am sure you did, madam, but sometimes it helps to have a little backup in these parts." He studied her face, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the stubborn set of her jaw. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with mere prettiness, all sharp angles and fierce determination. "I am Katherine Adams," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that was bold by frontier standards. He shook it, feeling the strength in her grip despite her small hands. "Quincy Fletcher. I work at the Triple R Ranch." "Well, Mr. Fletcher, I appreciate your intervention, even if I did not strictly require it. Perhaps you could recommend somewhere I might find more honest merchants." They spent the next hour walking through town while Quincy introduced her to the shop owners he trusted. Katherine proved to be quick-witted and observant, asking intelligent questions about the town and its people. Quincy found himself enjoying her company more than he had enjoyed anyone's in a long time. She did not simper or pretend to be helpless, and she met his eyes directly when they spoke, treating him as an equal rather than a potential suitor to be managed. When they parted ways, Quincy found himself thinking about her long after he should have turned his mind to other matters. There was something about Katherine Adams that had gotten under his skin, and he was not entirely sure what to do about it. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Quincy found reasons to ride into town more often than strictly necessary, and somehow those trips always seemed to coincide with times when Katherine might need assistance with something. She was settling into her role as schoolteacher, though it was clear the work was harder than she had anticipated. The children were often behind in their studies, and many of the parents saw education as a luxury they could not afford when there was farm work to be done. Katherine threw herself into the challenge with a determination that both impressed and worried Quincy. She worked long hours, often by candlelight, preparing lessons and visiting families to convince them to keep their children in school. She was wearing herself thin, and Quincy could see the exhaustion in the shadows under her eyes. One evening he found her sitting on the steps of the schoolhouse, her head in her hands. He dismounted and approached cautiously. "Miss Adams, are you all right?" She looked up and he could see she had been crying. "I am sorry. I did not expect anyone to see me like this." Quincy sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Bad day," Katherine laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I had 12 students when I started. Now I have 7. The others have been pulled out to work on their family farms. One of the fathers told me I was filling his daughter's head with nonsense and that she would be better off learning to cook and sew. That must be hard to hear." "What is hard is knowing he might be right," Katherine said bitterly. "What good is Shakespeare or mathematics to a girl who will spend her entire life cooking meals and bearing children? Maybe I am the fool for thinking education matters out here." Quincy was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "My mother taught me to read," he said finally. "We did not have much, and there were plenty who thought it was a waste of time. But those books opened up worlds I never would have known existed. They taught me that there was more to life than what I could see in front of me. Maybe that farmer is right that his daughter will spend her life cooking and raising children. But maybe she will also be able to read stories to those children and teach them that they can dream of more than they have. That is not nothing." Katherine turned to look at him, really look at him, and something shifted between them. "You are not what I expected, Mr. Fletcher. What did you expect? Someone less thoughtful, someone who fit the image I had in my head of what a cowboy should be." Quincy allowed himself a small smile. And what image was that? Oh, rough and crude and interested only in cattle and cards. Well, I am interested in cattle, Quincy admitted, though I have never been much for cards, but I figure there is no reason a man cannot care about both horses and books. They talked until the stars came out, sharing stories about their lives and their dreams. Quincy learned that Katherine had lost her mother to consumption, and that her father had remarried quickly to a woman who made it clear she did not want a grown stepdaughter underfoot. Katherine learned that Quincy had lost both parents to cholera when he was 15 and had been making his own way in the world ever since. When Quincy finally rode back to the ranch that night, he knew with absolute certainty that he was falling in love with Katherine Adams. It was a terrifying and exhilarating feeling, and he had no idea what to do about it. Katherine was discovering similar feelings, though she tried to convince herself they were merely gratitude and friendship. Quincy had become a fixture in her life, showing up to repair a broken window or bring her fresh vegetables from the ranch garden. He never demanded anything in return, never presumed upon her gratitude, and that made her trust him in a way she had never trusted any man. But she was also aware of the vast differences between them. She was educated and refined from a world of books and culture. He was a cowboy, hard-working and honest but unpolished by Eastern standards. It should not matter, but she knew the world would judge them harshly if they pursued anything beyond friendship. Summer faded into autumn, and with it came preparation for the harsh Arkansas winter. Katherine continued teaching, though her student numbers fluctuated with the demands of harvest season. She had learned to be more flexible, adapting her lessons to the realities of frontier life while still maintaining high standards for learning. Quincy had become bolder in his attentions, though he was always respectful. He brought her small gifts, things he had made or found on the range, a piece of petrified wood polished smooth by water, a book of poetry he had ordered from a catalog, a wooden box he had carved himself, simple but well made. "You are courting me," Katherine said one afternoon when he brought her wildflowers he had picked on the way into town. Quincy met her eyes steadily. "I am. Is that all right?" Katherine should have said no. She should have explained all the reasons why a relationship between them was impossible. Instead, she found herself saying, "Yes, it is more than all right." They began walking out together, and the town took notice. Some approved, seeing them as a good match, two hard-working people who deserved happiness. Others whispered that Katherine was lowering herself, that she should set her sights on a professional man, perhaps a lawyer or doctor, not a mere cowboy. Katherine ignored the gossips, and Quincy had long ago stopped caring what people thought of him. Their courtship was chaste by necessity, always conducted in public view. But there were moments of stolen intimacy, the brush of his hand against hers, the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, the conversations that stretched late into the evening when they sat on her porch and talked about everything and nothing. "Tell me about the war," Katherine said one evening. It was late October, and the air had turned crisp with the promise of winter. Quincy stiffened. "Why do you want to know about that?" "Because it is part of who you are. I want to understand you, all of you." He was silent for so long that Katherine thought he would not answer. Then, haltingly, he began to speak. He told her about the fear and the boredom, the way war was mostly waiting, punctuated by moments of absolute terror. He told her about friends who had died in his arms, about decisions that still haunted him, about the relief and guilt he felt when it was finally over. Katherine reached for his hand, and this time when their fingers intertwined, neither pulled away. "Thank you for telling me. I do not talk about it much. I know. That is why it means so much that you told me." November arrived with unseasonably warm weather, and everyone in town remarked on how pleasant it was, how lucky they were to have such mild conditions. The ranchers were grateful for the extra time to prepare for winter, and the farmers rushed to bring in the last of their harvests. Katherine kept her school going, determined that the children would not fall behind just because the weather was cooperating. Then, on the 15th of November, everything changed. The day started normally enough. Katherine taught her lessons, and the children were restless in the warm afternoon air. Several people commented on the strange quality of the light, how the sky seemed to have a yellowish tinge to it. Animals were skittish, and experienced frontiersmen noted uneasily that the birds had stopped singing. Quincy felt it too, an electric tension in the air that made the horses nervous and set his teeth on edge. He was in town that afternoon, having come to meet Katherine after school let out. It had become their routine on Tuesdays and Fridays, and he looked forward to those walks more than he could express. The wind picked up suddenly, changing from a gentle breeze to something more aggressive. Quincy looked toward the horizon and felt his stomach drop. There, stretching from earth to sky, was a wall of dust the like of which he had never seen. It was bearing down on Fort Smith with terrifying speed, blotting out the sun as it came. "Get inside!" someone shouted, and the town erupted into chaos. Quincy ran toward the schoolhouse, fighting against the wind that was now strong enough to knock a man off his feet. He could hear the roar of the approaching storm, like a freight train bearing down on them. Dust was already filling the air, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. He burst through the schoolhouse door to find Katherine trying to calm her students, most of whom were crying in terror. "We need to get everyone somewhere safe," he shouted over the wind. "The church," Katherine yelled back. "It has a cellar." Together, they herded the children out into the maelstrom. The dust was so thick now that it was like trying to breathe sand. Quincy pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth, and Katherine tore strips from her petticoat to cover the children's faces. Visibility was down to nothing, the world reduced to a choking brown nightmare where even breathing was a struggle. They had taken only a dozen steps when Quincy realized they were lost. The familiar streets of Fort Smith had disappeared, every landmark swallowed by the storm. He could not see the church or any other building, could barely see the children stumbling around him. They were going to die out here, suffocated by the very air they breathed. Then he felt Katherine's hand searching for his, and without hesitation, he grabbed it and held on tight. In that moment, with death howling around them and terror clutching at his heart, Quincy made a promise to himself. If they survived this, he would never let go of her hand. He would hold on to Katherine Adams for the rest of his life. This way. He shouted, though he was not entirely sure which way he was leading them. He kept Katherine's hand firmly in his, and she kept her other hand on the nearest child, who kept hold of the next, forming a human chain as they stumbled through the blinding dust. Time lost all meaning in the storm. It might have been minutes or hours that they wandered, choking and gasping, each breath a struggle against the dust that filled their lungs. Quincy's eyes burned and teared, and he could taste grit between his teeth. His grip on Katherine's hand never wavered, and he could feel her squeezing back, drawing strength from the contact. Then, like a miracle, his outstretched hand connected with wood. A building. He felt along the wall until he found a door and threw his weight against it. The door burst open, and they tumbled inside, dragging the children with them. Quincy slammed the door shut against the storm and leaned against it, coughing violently. They were in the general store, and after a moment, his eyes adjusted enough to see other people huddled inside, refugees from the storm. Mr. Hoskins, the store owner who had tried to cheat Katherine months ago, was there with his wife and children. Several other families had taken shelter as well. Katherine immediately went to check on her students, making sure each child was accounted for and relatively unharmed. Quincy counted heads and felt relief wash over him. They had not lost anyone. 7 children, all present and accounted for, though scared and covered in dust. The storm raged outside for what felt like an eternity. The wind shrieked and howled, and dust found its way through every crack and crevice, creating a fine brown fog inside the building. People huddled together, covering their faces with whatever cloth they could find, trying not to breathe too deeply of the contaminated air. Quincy stayed close to Katherine, and when she finally allowed herself to stop fussing over the children and sit down, he pulled her against his side. She did not resist, instead leaning into him with a trust that made his heart ache. They sat like that for hours, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, while the world outside went mad. "I was so frightened," Katherine whispered at one point, her voice barely audible over the storm. "So was I," Quincy admitted, "but I knew I had to find you. I could not let anything happen to you." Katherine tilted her head up to look at him, and even in the dim, dusty light, he could see the emotion in her eyes. "When you took my hand out there, I knew everything would be all right. As long as I could hold on to you, I knew we would survive." Quincy wanted to kiss her then, propriety be damned, but they were surrounded by children and neighbors, so he settled for squeezing her closer and pressing his lips to her dusty hair. "I love you, Katherine Adams. I have been trying to find the right time to tell you, but I think nearly dying has convinced me there is no perfect moment. I just need you to know." "I love you too," Katherine said, and he could hear tears in her voice. "I tried not to. I told myself all the reasons it would not work. But I love you anyway, Quincy Fletcher, with everything I have." They held each other as the storm continued to rage, and around them, people pretended not to notice the intimacy of their embrace. When you were facing death, propriety seemed like a small concern. Finally, after what felt like days but was probably only 6 or 7 hours, the wind began to die down. The roar faded to a howl, then to a moan, and finally to silence. People waited another hour before venturing outside, unsure whether the storm had truly passed or was merely gathering its strength for another assault. When they finally opened the door, the sight that greeted them was apocalyptic. Fort Smith was buried under several inches of dust. Drifts had piled up against buildings like brown snow, and the air still hung thick with particles that caught in throats and stung eyes. But they were alive, and as people emerged from their various shelters, there was a sense of stunned gratitude mixed with horror at the destruction. The town organized quickly, experience with frontier hardships teaching them the importance of working together. Katherine's students were reunited with their grateful parents, many of whom thanked Quincy and Katherine with tears streaming down their dusty faces. If there had been any question before about whether Katherine belonged in Fort Smith, the fact that she had risked her life to save their children settled it definitively. The cleanup took days. Every surface was covered in dust, every building choked with it. People worked from dawn to dusk, sweeping and washing and trying to restore some semblance of normalcy. Katherine's schoolhouse had to be completely emptied and scrubbed, and Quincy organized a crew from the ranch to help with the work. Through it all, he and Katherine were inseparable. The storm had stripped away any pretense of casual courtship. They had declared their love while facing death, and there was no taking those words back. Nor did either of them want to. 2 weeks after the storm, Quincy came to call on Katherine with a ring he had commissioned from the town's silversmith. It was simple but well made, a silver band with a small garnet set into it. He found Katherine at the schoolhouse, preparing lessons for the next day, and his heart hammered in his chest as he approached her. "Katherine," he said, and she looked up from her papers with a smile that made him forget everything he had planned to say. "Quincy, I did not expect you this evening." He cleared his throat, suddenly more nervous than he had been facing down the dust storm. "I know we have not been courting long by conventional standards, but that storm made me realize something. Life is too short and too uncertain to waste time. I know what I want, and what I want is you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life with you, have children with you, grow old with you." Katherine stood up, her eyes wide and bright. "Quincy." He dropped to one knee, pulling out the ring. "Katherine Adams, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a cowboy who loves you more than he ever thought it was possible to love another person?" "Yes," Katherine said, and then louder, "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you." Quincy stood and swept her into his arms, kissing her properly for the first time. She tasted like dust and determination and coming home, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would love her for the rest of his life. They were married a month later in the same church where they had planned to take shelter during the storm. It was a simple ceremony, but half the town turned out for it, including the entire crew from the Triple R Ranch. Katherine wore a dress of cream silk that she had brought from Philadelphia, and Quincy wore his best suit, the one he saved for special occasions. The ranch foreman, a grizzled old cowboy named Samuel Reed, served as Quincy's best man, while Mrs. Peterson, the mayor's wife, stood up for Katherine. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, the church erupted in applause. They held the reception in the town square, with tables groaning under the weight of food that people had contributed. It was frontier hospitality at its finest, everyone coming together to celebrate the union of two people who had proven themselves worthy of respect. As the sun set and fiddle music filled the air, Quincy and Katherine danced together, swaying to the music while their friends and neighbors looked on with approval. "Are you happy?" Quincy asked, his lips close to her ear. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Katherine said. "Though I confess I am a bit nervous about what comes next." "What comes next is we go home," Quincy said. "I have been building us a house on a parcel of land I bought from the ranch. It is small, but it is ours." Katherine pulled back to look at him in surprise. "You bought land?" "I have been saving for years," Quincy explained. "I always planned to start my own place eventually. Meeting you just gave me a reason to speed up those plans. I want to give you a real home, Katherine, a place where you can feel settled and safe." Tears sparkled in Katherine's eyes. "You have already given me that just by being you." The house Quincy had built was indeed small, just 3 rooms, but it was solid and well made, with glass windows and a real wooden floor. He carried Katherine over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the main room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Fletcher," he said. "It sounds so strange to hear that name," Katherine admitted, "but I like it. I like being your wife." That night they consummated their marriage, and if Katherine had been nervous, Quincy's gentleness and patience soon put her at ease. They learned each other slowly, tenderly, with none of the rushed fumbling that characterized some frontier marriages. Quincy was determined that Katherine would never regret choosing him, and he showed her with his hands and lips and body just how much she meant to him. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their bed, Katherine's head on Quincy's chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her. "I never thought I could be this happy," she whispered. "I never thought I would find someone who understood me the way you do." "I never thought I would find anyone at all," Quincy said honestly. "I figured I would spend my life alone, married to the ranch. And then you stepped off that stagecoach, all fire and determination, and everything changed." You ever regret it, marrying someone so different from you?" Quincy tightened his arms around her. "Never. Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Katherine. I would walk through 1,000 dust storms if it meant finding your hand again." They settled into married life with surprising ease. Katherine continued teaching, though she now had to balance her school duties with running a household. Quincy continued working at the Triple R Ranch, though he was gradually building up his own small herd on their property. They worked hard, as everyone did on the frontier, but they were happy in a way that made the hard work worthwhile. Winter came, and with it, new challenges. Katherine struggled with the isolation of frontier life, used to the constant social stimulation of Philadelphia. But Quincy was there to remind her why she had come west in the first place. And together, they hosted gatherings for her students and their families, turning their small home into a center of community life. Spring arrived with dramatic suddenness, the frozen ground thawing and giving way to wildflowers that carpeted the prairie in riots of color. Katherine discovered she was pregnant in April, and the news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. Childbirth was dangerous on the frontier, far from doctors and proper medical care, and they both knew women who had died bringing new life into the world. But Katherine was strong and healthy, and she approached pregnancy with the same determination she brought to everything else. She continued teaching until she was 7 months along, only stopping when climbing the schoolhouse steps became too difficult. The community rallied around them, with the ranch women sharing advice and offering support. Their son was born on a cold December night, arriving 3 weeks early but healthy and strong. Quincy assisted the midwife, and when he finally held his son for the first time, tears streamed down his weathered face. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are amazing." "I cannot believe you just did that." Katherine was exhausted but glowing with triumph. What should we name him? They had discussed names for months, unable to agree on anything. But looking at his son's tiny face, Quincy suddenly knew. "Matthew, after your father." Katherine's eyes filled with tears. Her relationship with her father had been complicated, strained by his quick remarriage after her mother's death, but she had loved him despite everything. "Are you sure?" "I am sure. He is Matthew Robert Fletcher, and he is going to have the best mother in the world." Motherhood transformed Katherine in ways she had not expected. She loved her son with a fierce protectiveness that sometimes frightened her in its intensity. She was determined that Matthew would have every advantage, that he would grow up knowing he was loved and valued. But she also missed teaching, missed the intellectual stimulation of working with her students. When Matthew was 6 months old, Katherine made a decision. She approached the town council with a proposal to build a proper school, larger and better equipped than the tiny schoolhouse she had been using. She had saved money from her teaching salary, and with that as a foundation, she launched a fundraising campaign that galvanized the entire community. Quincy was her strongest supporter, organizing work crews and donating materials. The new schoolhouse was completed in the fall of 1869, a 2-room building with proper desks, a large chalkboard, and even a small library. Katherine resumed teaching, bringing Matthew with her and setting up a crib in the corner of the classroom where he could sleep during lessons. The town continued to grow and change around them. The war scars were gradually healing, though tensions still flared occasionally between former enemies. But Fort Smith was looking toward the future rather than dwelling on the past, and Katherine and Quincy were part of that forward momentum. Their second child, a daughter they named Grace Margaret Fletcher, was born in the spring of 1871. She was quieter than her brother, with her mother's green eyes and her father's steady temperament. Matthew, now 2.5, was enchanted by his baby sister, constantly wanting to help take care of her. The years that followed were good ones, full of hard work but also deep satisfaction. Quincy's small ranch grew steadily, and he eventually left the Triple R to focus full-time on his own operation. Catherine's school thrived, with enrollment growing every year as more families settled in the area. They added rooms to their house as their family and fortunes grew, and what had started as a simple 3-room cabin became a proper home. In 1873, tragedy struck when a cholera outbreak swept through Fort Smith. Katherine threw herself into nursing the sick, despite Quincy's protests that she was risking her own life and the lives of their children. She could not stand by and do nothing, she insisted. These were her students and their families, and they needed help. Quincy supported her as he always did. Even when he was terrified she would contract the disease. He took over care of the children completely, keeping them away from the infected areas, while Katherine worked herself to exhaustion caring for the sick. By the time the outbreak ended, 27 people had died, but many more had survived thanks to the tireless efforts of women like Katherine. The experience changed something in their community. Katherine's status, already secure after the dust storm, became unassailable. She was no longer seen as an outsider or an Eastern woman playing at frontier life. She was one of them, someone who had proven herself willing to sacrifice for her neighbors. Their third child, another son they named James Andrew Fletcher, was born in 1874. The birth was difficult, and afterward, the doctor advised Katherine not to have more children. It was devastating news as they had hoped for a large family, but they were grateful for the 3 healthy children they had. As their children grew, Katherine and Quincy worked together to ensure they had every opportunity. Matthew showed an early aptitude for learning and devoured every book he could get his hands on. Grace was quieter but no less intelligent, with a gift for drawing and a fascination with the natural world. James was still too young to show his talents, but he was a cheerful, affectionate child who brought light wherever he went. The years flowed by, marked by the rhythms of frontier life. Planting and harvest, birth and death, celebration and sorrow. Through it all, Katherine and Quincy remained each other's anchors, the love that had sparked during a dust storm growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. In 1878, the railroad finally came to Fort Smith, connecting the town to the larger world in ways that had previously been impossible. It brought changes, some welcome and some less so. The frontier was gradually becoming civilized, the wild edges being tamed and smoothed away. Katherine welcomed the changes, seeing them as progress, while Quincy sometimes felt nostalgic for the rougher, simpler days of his youth. But they adapted together, as they always did. Quincy's ranch became more profitable with the ability to ship cattle by rail, and Katherine's school continued to expand, eventually requiring a second teacher to help manage the growing enrollment. They were prosperous by frontier standards, though they never forgot the lean early years when every dollar had been precious. Matthew left for college in 1882, heading east to attend the same university where Katherine's father had studied. It was a bittersweet moment for both parents, proud of their son's accomplishments, but sad to see him leave. Grace had announced her intention to become a teacher like her mother, and Katherine was already training her in the classroom, letting her help with the younger students. James, now 8 years old, was determined to be a rancher like his father. He followed Quincy everywhere, pestering him with questions and begging to help with even the most difficult tasks. Quincy saw himself in his youngest son and worked hard to teach him not just the skills of ranching, but also the values of hard work, honesty, and treating others with respect. The town continued to grow and change. Fort Smith was no longer a rough frontier outpost, but a proper town with paved streets, gas lighting, and all the trappings of civilization. Some of the old-timers complained that it had lost its character, but most welcomed the improvements. In 1885, Katherine and Quincy celebrated their 10th anniversary with a party that brought together everyone who had been part of their journey. The ranch crew was there, along with Katherine's students past and present, neighbors and friends. As they danced together under the stars, Quincy thought back to that terrifying day when a dust storm had changed everything. "You remember when I found your hand in that storm?" he asked Katherine as they swayed to the music. "Of course," she said. "How could I forget?" "That was the day everything became clear to me, the day I knew I could not live without you. I promised myself then that if we survived, I would never let go, and I have not. Through everything these past 10 years, the good and the bad, I have held on to you." Katherine smiled up at him, her face showing the passage of time but still beautiful to him. "And I have held on to you. You are my rock, Quincy Fletcher. You are the reason I survived that first year on the frontier, the reason I have been able to build a life here." They kissed, oblivious to their guests, lost in each other as they had been from the beginning. Around them, people smiled and turned away, giving them a moment of privacy. Everyone in Fort Smith knew the story of how the dust storm had brought Katherine and Quincy together, and it had become the stuff of local legend, a romantic tale that people told to illustrate the power of love to overcome any obstacle. As the years continued to pass, their family continued to grow, not with more children of their own, but with the marriage of their children and the arrival of grandchildren. Matthew returned from college in 1886 with a law degree and a wife, a clever young woman named Sarah who fit seamlessly into the family. They settled in Fort Smith, and Matthew opened a law practice that quickly became successful. Grace married in 1888, wedding a young teacher who had come west to work at the school. They took over Katherine's classroom when she finally decided to retire after 20 years of teaching. Katherine joked that she was not really retiring, just shifting her focus to spoiling her grandchildren, but everyone knew she would never truly stop being a teacher. It was too much a part of who she was. James, true to his childhood declaration, took over the running of the ranch when Quincy's joints started to ache too much for the day-to-day work. He married a rancher's daughter in 1890, and together they expanded the operation, buying additional land and building the ranch into one of the most successful in the region. Katherine and Quincy settled into a comfortable retirement, dividing their time between reading, spending time with their grandchildren, and working on various community projects. Katherine started a lending library in town, donating many of her own books to get it started. Quincy served on the town council, using his years of experience to help guide Fort Smith's continued growth. In 1895, the town decided to celebrate the 30th anniversary of its incorporation, and as part of the festivities, they asked longtime residents to share their stories. Katherine and Quincy were among those invited to speak, and they stood together on a platform in the town square, holding hands as they always did. 30 years ago, Quincy began, Fort Smith was a rough frontier town, barely more than a collection of wooden buildings and big dreams. Some of you remember those days, the hardship and the danger, but also the sense of community and shared purpose. Katherine picked up the story. "I arrived in 1867, fresh from Philadelphia and utterly unprepared for frontier life. I thought I would teach for a few years and then return east. I never imagined I would fall in love with this place and the people in it. November 15, 1867, changed everything for us, Quincy said. A dust storm hit Fort Smith, one of the worst anyone had ever seen. Katherine and I were trying to get her students to safety, but we got lost in the storm. I found her hand in that blinding dust, and I promised myself then that if we survived, I would never let go. Katherine squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, the gesture automatic after nearly 3 decades together. That storm tested us in ways we could not have imagined, but it also showed us what we were capable of when we worked together. And it taught us that love can be found in the most unexpected places, in the most terrifying moments. We have built a good life here, Quincy continued. We have raised 3 wonderful children who have given us 9 grandchildren so far, with more on the way. We have watched Fort Smith grow from a rough frontier town into a thriving community, and through it all, we have held onto each other. The crowd applauded, many wiping away tears. The story of the dust storm and the cowboy who found the schoolteacher's hand had been told many times over the years, but hearing it from Katherine and Quincy themselves gave it new weight and meaning. After the speech, dozens of people came up to thank them for their contributions to the town. Former students told Katherine how she had changed their lives by teaching them to read and think critically. Men who had worked for Quincy spoke of his fairness and integrity. It was humbling and gratifying in equal measure. That night, lying in bed in the house they had expanded and improved over the years, Katherine turned to Quincy with a contented sigh. "We have had a good life, have we not?" "The best," Quincy agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible when I was a lonely cowboy working other people's ranches." "Do you ever think about that day, the storm?" "All the time," Quincy admitted. "It was the most terrifying and the most important day of my life. If that storm had not hit, I might never have told you how I felt. I might have let you slip away because I was too afraid to take a chance." Katherine rolled over to face him, her hand reaching for his in the darkness. "But you did not let me slip away. You found me in that storm, and you held on, and you never let go. That is who you are, Quincy Fletcher. You are the man who keeps his promises, who holds on when things get hard." "I had something worth holding on to," Quincy said softly. "I had you." They fell asleep holding hands as they had every night for nearly 30 years, and as they would for all the years to come. The turn of the century brought more changes. Fort Smith was now fully modernized, with electric lights, telephones, and all the conveniences of modern life. The frontier days were truly over, existing now only in memory and the stories told by those who had lived through them. But the values of that era, the self-reliance and community spirit and determination to build something lasting, those remained. Katherine and Quincy grew old together gracefully, their love deepening rather than fading with the passage of time. They celebrated their 40th anniversary in 1907, surrounded by 3 children, 14 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. It was a joyous occasion, marked by laughter and stories and the warmth of family. 40 years, Katherine marveled as they danced together, moving more slowly now but still in perfect harmony. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that we met, and sometimes it feels like we have been together forever. "Forever is not long enough," Quincy said, and though the words were sentimental, his tone was utterly sincere. "I want a dozen more lifetimes with you, Katherine, 100 more." "Well, we will have to settle for whatever time we are given," Katherine said practically, though her eyes were bright with emotion. "But whatever time that is, I will be grateful for every moment. You have given me a beautiful life, Quincy. You have given me love and family and purpose." I could not have asked for more. They continued to dance as their family looked on, and the younger generation saw in them a model of what marriage could be. Not always easy, not without struggles and compromises, but fundamentally built on a foundation of love and mutual respect that could weather any storm. Quincy passed away in the spring of 1912, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 71. He had lived a full life, seeing his children grown and successful, his grandchildren thriving, and his great-grandchildren beginning their own journeys. Katherine was devastated by his loss, having spent 45 years with him by her side, but she also found comfort in knowing that they had made the most of every moment they had been given. She lived for another 6 years, spending her time with family and working on a memoir about the early days of Fort Smith. She wrote extensively about the dust storm and how it had changed her life, about the cowboy who had found her hand in the blinding dust and kept the promise he made to never let go. The memoir became a treasured family document, passed down through generations, a testament to enduring love and the courage it takes to build a life on the frontier. Katherine died in 1918, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her fiercely. Her last words were about Quincy, about how she could feel him waiting for her, ready to take her hand once more. She was buried beside him in the Fort Smith Cemetery, their graves marked with a simple stone that read, Quincy and Katherine Fletcher. They found each other in the storm and held on forever. Their great-granddaughter, a young woman named Catherine Grace who had been named after her, was the one who finished editing the memoir and had it published in 1920. It became a regional bestseller, resonating with readers who recognized in Quincy and Katherine's story something universal about love and commitment, and the choices we make that define our lives. The house that Quincy had built and they had expanded together remained in the family for generations, each successive owner adding their own touches but preserving the core structure. The schoolhouse that Katherine had fought to build became a historical landmark, preserved as a reminder of the importance of education even on the frontier. The ranch that Quincy had started and James had expanded continued to operate, still in family hands, still raising cattle on the same land where Quincy had once worked as a hired hand. Fort Smith itself continued to grow and change, eventually becoming a small city, but it never forgot its roots. The story of the dust storm and the schoolteacher and the cowboy became part of local folklore, told to school children and tourists alike. A historical marker was erected on the site where the old general store had stood, commemorating the place where Katherine and Quincy had taken shelter and declared their love while the world raged outside. The descendants of Katherine and Quincy spread across the country, but many remained in Arkansas, drawn by the same sense of place and purpose that had kept their ancestors there. They became teachers and ranchers, lawyers and doctors, artists and engineers, but they all carried within them the legacy of two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting. On November 15th each year, the family gathered in Fort Smith to remember the dust storm that had brought Katherine and Quincy together. They would visit the cemetery and place flowers on the graves, and then they would gather at the old house for a meal and stories. The youngest generation would hear again about great-great-great-grandpa Quincy, who had found great-great-great-grandma Katherine's hand in the storm and never let go, who had kept his promise across 45 years of marriage and created a family legacy that continued to inspire. Because that was what love did. It endured. It persisted through hardship and loss, through the inevitable changes that time brought. It was not always dramatic or romantic, though it could be those things. Mostly it was quiet and steady, a hand reaching out in the darkness, a promise kept day after day, year after year, decade after decade. Katherine and Quincy had understood that. They had learned it in the most visceral way possible, when survival depended on holding tight to each other and refusing to let go. And they had carried that lesson through their entire lives together, through every challenge and triumph, through the ordinary moments and the extraordinary ones. Their love story became legend, but the truth at the heart of it was simple and profound. Love was a choice, made not once but constantly, renewed with every morning and every challenge. It was finding someone's hand in the storm and holding on, not because it was easy but because letting go was unthinkable. It was building a life together, brick by brick and moment by moment, until you looked back and saw that you had created something beautiful and lasting. And that legacy, that understanding of what love could be when it was given freely and tended carefully, was Katherine and Quincy's true gift to the generations that followed them. They had proved that love could flourish even in the harshest conditions, that two people from different worlds could come together and create something stronger than either could have achieved alone. The dust storm that had terrified Fort Smith on that November day in 1867 had long since faded into history. But the love it had sparked, the connection it had forged between a cowboy and a schoolteacher, that continued to resonate, a light that still shone bright more than a century later, showing the way forward for all who sought to understand the true meaning of love and commitment, and the courage it takes to hold on when everything else is falling apart.